Thank you for joining us for this episode of our Ocean View podcast. We are going to be talking about the history behind Christmas and some of the awesome things of where our Christmas traditions came from. And we are joined by our resident historian, Pastor Terry. Okay, so now that we're here talking about more history, which is awesome. Actually, it makes me very excited because I love knowing where things came from.
Said nobody when you said history.
Oh,
it's so awesome. It's
it
so
is.
exciting. Half our audience just tuned out.
No, it's okay. They'll come back. They'll go to sleep and come back. Sorry. All right. So when we think about Christmas, we often think about just kind of the cozy traditions, the familiar imagery. You know, you think about white Christmases. You think about, now we think about Santa Claus. We think about Christmas trees. How much of what we celebrate today is rooted in like history versus modern invention?
Oh, that's good. Well, there's a lot, actually, and I'm excited today as we talk about it because I always, as a kid, would run down and our parents had a rule is that we could only open our stocking first when we came downstairs. Mm-hmm. And nobody ever stopped to ask the question, why do we hang socks and over a fireplace and put stuff in it? That just is really weird. And no one questions it. So today we're actually going to find that out because there is tradition to that. But I think you're more than anything going back to the origins of Christmas. I think it's important to really understand, December 25th. Why do we celebrate that? Does it have Christian roots? Does it have pagan roots? So really briefly, I'll just give a couple of things to those that actually enjoy that history. There are two different pagan traditions that people will call on when they go to why do we celebrate Christmas? And the principle of thought is that we celebrate December 25th because we wanted to take something that was light and cheerful, like celebrating Christ's birth, and we wanted to oppose dark traditions, which were pagan traditions. And so we took a date on the calendar to combat that. I'm actually, with the studying that I've done recently and linguistics and just taking a look at when writings were actually done and what years they were done, I'm actually going to offer a different thought because I believe my thought pattern has changed on that. There were two major pagan traditions, Tori. One was called Sol Invictus, and Sol Invictus was...
Sounds very ominous.
It was. It was really the worshiping of a sun god, and so that festival or that pagan celebration moved around the calendar a lot, but during history, it settled in around December, winter months. And so many Christians believe that that's why we brought Christmas to combat that. The other pagan festival was known as the Festival of Saturnalia. I've actually taught on this. I've actually preached on this, where in the Roman, they would have a week during the dark winter periods where in Roman culture, basically anything went. You could commit crimes. You could kind of have parties that were very debaucherous, and everything was, at the end of a week, forgiven. And so get it out of your system, have fun, do whatever you want to do.
Maybe that's where we get New Year's Eve.
Well, maybe, but enjoy the things of the flesh for a week, mm-hmm. and then everything at the end of the week was forgiven. So the principal thought is that Christians decided to place on the calendar a celebration of Christ to combat all of that pagan ritual. However, the reason why I'd say my thought process has changed is actually when you look at dates, because we actually have now in documentation, comments or writings about the celebration of Christ's birth prior to Sol Invictus and prior to the writings of the Festival of Saturnalia. And so now what we actually see is, because we actually see Christians celebrating during December 25th, we actually see them moving those pagan holidays to combat Christians. So we've actually seen it flip as opposed to the opposite. So for those that wonder, is it okay to celebrate Christmas? Should we celebrate Christmas? Yes, because we actually now see archaeology has told us that those celebrations were done prior to some of those pagan rituals and festivals that we see in history.
Wow. So when did Christians first begin celebrating Jesus' birth?
We see written documentation all the way back to the early 4th and late 3rd century. So we
Wow.
actually see documentation and we see writings to actually say that this has been happening. Now, many people ask the question, and I know probably that's a follow-up question for you,
Yes.
is like, is December 25th actually Christ's birthday? The answer is most likely no. December 25th, like, do we know the actual date? No, that's why I say most likely, because we don't know the actual date. What we do know, though, is most theologians believe the reason why we chose December 25th most likely is because of Scripture. Because when you read the writings of Scripture, you read about the darkness. Within the darkness, a great light has come. Mm-hmm. And so usually in origin stories and history, darkness was always associated
Sorry, you said origin story. I went right to comic books.
Oh, sorry about that. But origin stories always reflect to, when you talk about darkness, it always reflected to winter. Mm-hmm. So December being winter. One of the other reasons why is the shepherds. And so the shepherds most likely would have been out in the fields probably later than December, but we don't know. Shepherds could have been out earlier, and you might say, well, like, when were the shepherds out? Most likely they would have been out around springtime, around March, all the way through November, and then after November, the shepherds really would not have been out at that time. That's why most believe that Christ's actual birth happened probably in the springtime. But if you were to say, are we sure? No, because there's also theologians that believe that it's based upon when Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit. That would have been around springtime, and it would have counted the calendar all the way 9 months later. Some believe it was November. Some believe it was December. We don't know, but what we do know, though, is that Christians wanted a date to be able to celebrate that event. And so they chose a couple of different reasons, and they placed it on December 25th.
Do we know when the census took place? That they were going back to?
There are all kinds, and again, there's all kinds of writings as to when it would have been taken. Again, a lot of people believe that maybe it would have been taken in the springtime, just because from a traveling standpoint, it had been easier. Winter, not so much. So that's why we when people ask me, do you know that you know, I typically say, we don't. It could have been anywhere. I would say I don't believe it was December 25th. I don't believe it was during that month. Most theologians don't believe it was during the month of December. But are we 100% sure? No, we're not.
So let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk maybe about the history of some of our favorite traditions. Yeah. So the Christmas tree, which seems like one of the biggest symbols of Christmas. Can you tell us maybe where it originated and how it became a little more widespread? Yeah.
Back in history, there was a man by the name of Saint Boniface. Oh. And Saint Boniface, on December 24th, he would go ahead and cut down a tree. And that has a little bit of pagan association from Christians combating what pagans would do. So in many of the Nordic traditions, they would dedicate a fir tree to Thor. No. A quote-unquote god. Mm-hmm. And so what St. Boniface did is he would cut down a tree that typically was dedicated to Thor, and then on December 24th, he would go ahead and put it up, and usually in whether it was a square or a place where he could gather people, and then he would begin to tell the creation story. Oh. And in the creation story, he would talk about Adam and Eve, and then he would go ahead and he'd begin decorating that tree with apples as he illustrated what God was doing. And so on December 24th, he would do it. On December 25th, the tree would be decorated with a lot of different items from that story, and they would begin to celebrate Christmas. So for many people who are wondering, like, why do some people wait until December 24th to decorate their tree? It comes from this history. That's when the first Christmas tree began to be decorated, was on December 24th, and then on December 25th, it was fully decorated and you celebrated Christmas.
So it was like the first kids ministry moment of telling stories.
It was, absolutely.
What were those? Oh, the flannel graphs, those old back in the day. Yes. It was the very first flannel graph.
That's good.
So talk to us a little bit. We mentioned stockings. Tell us the history of stockings.
Well, before we get to stockings, let me mention one more thing about the tree I just remembered, is on the tree as well, some people say, well, how did we get to modernizing a little bit? We see that Martin Luther, believe it or not, in Germany, he was one of the first that actually began to decorate trees with lights. And I know we're going to get into Christmas lights in just a bit. And so what he would do is he would actually take candles, and he would actually light candles, and he would decorate his Christmas tree in Germany. But that was very, very niche to Germany. It wasn't widespread. It didn't go throughout Europe until there was a royal member of a German family who married a royal member of English family. And when they celebrated their Christmas, they brought the tradition of lighting candles over to England. Well, royalty in England was much more popular. And so when many people saw that the royal family was decorating a Christmas tree with candles, it spread like wildfire, no pun intended, all throughout Europe, and really became a tradition of putting light on top of Christmas trees, which ultimately spread to the United States, which is why we decorate our Christmas tree with light. Now, it was candles back then, but that's where we get the tradition of beginning Christmas lights.
So then before stockings, why don't you talk about Christmas lights since we're there?
That'd be good. Candles were used first, as I mentioned, and so I'm going to look at some notes here. I want to give this to you. Edward Johnson was Thomas Edison's partner.
Okay.
And so Edison was the first to create the Christmas strand of lights. There weren't many. And actually in history novels, they used to say that people would ride in trains, and as they passed by Edison's workshop, they would see his Christmas lights decorating certain things and always wondered what they were. Well, his partner Edward Johnson decided that he was going to go ahead and go into it. So the first strand of Christmas lights that we have recorded was decorated red, white, and blue. And there was significance to it because Grover Cleveland was the first to ask for Christmas lights to be put around the Christmas tree in the White House way back when. And it could have been the White House. I don't remember when the White House was built. But he decided for the national Christmas tree to be decorated with red, white, and blue. And then Calvin Coolidge in 1923, he was the first to begin the decorating and the lighting of the national Christmas tree. That was the first one they had. And he commissioned them to decorate it with electrical Christmas lights. No longer candles, but electrical Christmas lights. And so they went ahead and they did that. And that's where we see the origin of the first decorating of Christmas lights. But then it continues on. And this is what I love, Tori, because I grew up my first memories of Christmas were in the 70s, the late 70s. And I remember that in most people's yards and most people's tree, you saw certain types of Christmas lights. There weren't many. It was the outdoor lights had the strands that had the big bulbs that were on it. And the indoor ones, usually in the north, they were usually different types of colors on the strands. Those were the most popular. But many people don't realize from around the 1920 to about 1960, there was only one brand of Christmas lights. And the reason why is because gentleman by the name of Albert Sadaka, he created what is known as Noma. Noma was the brand of Christmas lights. And if you Google it at home and you take a look at it, you will see that box, and your parents will probably recognize it because there was only one brand up until the 1960s. And the reason why he decided to offer that commercially to so many is because tragically, in the 1920s, there was a Christmas tree that lit on fire. And when it did, it burnt the house down and killed the family. Oh, and Albert Sadaka said, I don't want to see this happen again, and so I want to be able to help families. And so from the 1920s to 1960s, he created what is known as Christmas lights commercially, and families started decorating. And until the 1960s, there was only one brand. And then after that, we saw other companies begin to join in, and now you can't walk through an aisle without seeing so many different brands of Christmas lights.
I remember I think it was my grandparents had a tree that had the lights that it would like bubble. Like they had those little bubble lights. Those were really fun.
Oh, by the way, the first Christmas tree that was decorated with lights was a revolving Christmas tree. Back in the 70s, we used to have one where they used to put it on a pedestal, and the pedestal would revolve so that people could see all of the decorations on the tree. We don't see that much now, but that's where that began.
No, I usually put my ugly ones on the back.
We usually don't decorate the back. We shove it in a corner so that we don't have to get as much.
Yeah, it's like, I need to put this on the tree, but it's not my favorite, so it's going to go on the back of the tree. Okay, so talk to us now about stockings. Where did
Stockings.
the idea of hanging socks?
Stocking. This is a great one. So there was a man by the name of Saint Nicholas, and I know we're going to talk about the origin of Santa Claus in just a little bit. Saint Nicholas, that's where we get Santa Claus. But talking about stockings, Saint Nicholas was an amazing gentleman. And why don't I talk about Santa Claus? Like why at the same time? Because they're both intertwined. So we get the idea of Saint Nick from Saint Nicholas. He was born in and raised in Turkey, in modern day Turkey. Myra, Turkey is actually where he's from. And Saint Nicholas knew a family. He was known as being kind and pious meaning very caring and loving. He cared for the poor, and he was very giving. And so the story goes that he knew a family with 3 daughters, and the family did not have much money. And St. Nicholas did not want to embarrass the parents in front of their children, and he didn't want to be the hero. And we say that here at our church is our job as ministers is not to be the hero of the students or the kids that we minister to. We want to help the parents be the heroes to their family. And so St. Nicholas knew that principle, so he decided in the cover of a night that he was going to gift these 3 girls and surprise them. So on Christmas night, December 24th, when the family was asleep, he took 3 gold balls and he tossed them into the windows of the house of these 3 young girls. And he did so that way they wouldn't know who did it. Well, the story goes that one of those gold balls actually, when he threw it into the window, fell into a stocking that was drying by the fireplace at night. The next morning, when the 3 girls awoke, one of the girls found the gold balls in the stocking, and they didn't know where it came from. And that's where we get the history of hanging your stockings by the fire at night, and St. Nicholas will put gifts within the stockings. But that's why we celebrate with the stockings.
That's fun.
Yeah.
They were literally old socks.
They were old socks.
Old stinky socks.
Used old socks as well.
So talk to us. Another fun one that I really don't know the origin of is mistletoe.
Mistletoe.
Tell us about mistletoe.
Mistletoe. Believe it or not, it was mistletoe was ancient Druids used to believe that mistletoe was a form of good luck, and so. But then it in the Nords tradition, it became something of love and friendship. And then in England, we see the modern day origin of the mistletoe kind of arise, although with a little bit of a twist. And I think I like the English twist a little bit better. Many people believe, if you take the mistletoe and you're under the mistletoe, that you have to give a kiss. Well, in England, when it first arose, mistletoe had berries on them. And so if you had a mistletoe, depending on the amount of berries, you would pluck a berry off, you would go up to someone, you'd hold the mistletoe over, and you would hand them the berry. And for every berry on the mistletoe, you had to give out the same amount of kisses.
Wow.
And so I like to think if you found a girl that you really, really like, you would just keep giving her all the berries and keep kissing her. So that's where we see the modern day mistletoe come into effect.
Oh my goodness. And then the plague took place. So the other one that is interesting, because we all do this, especially in our church, in our churches around the world. What is the origin of Christmas carols?
Christmas carols is great. St. Francis of Assisi actually was the originator of the Christmas carol. He used to organize nativity plays. If you ever wonder where the modern day nativity came from, St. Francis of Assisi, he would organize nativity plays, and then they would sing songs during these plays to honor Jesus Christ. Well, that spread throughout Europe. And so when it spread throughout Europe, the first caroling was really stationary. They didn't kind of go from place to place. They would stop in a market or somewhere, much like think about Italy. You usually were in a market square and you would do plays and everyone would watch. Well, in England, they would basically model it. And so they would sing Christmas carols until 1647. In 1647, all the carols stopped. A Puritan by the name of Oliver Cromwell in England stopped celebrating carols and stopped celebrating Christmas. So the carolers would sing in secret. They would gather in smaller groups and they would sing in secret because they wanted to continue the tradition of celebrating Jesus Christ. Now, when it came back, they would gather on Christmas Eve and they would begin to sing. And the people who sang were called waits. And the reason why they were called waits is not because they ate too much figgy pudding, but because they were modeling what the shepherds were doing. They were waiting in the field, watching their flocks at night. And so as they were waiting on December 24th, they would sing, and they would sing to other individuals. Well, as the singing continued to grow, then people decided that instead of us just singing in one area, we need to bring love and good cheer to our neighbors. And most neighborhoods knew one another. And so I don't necessarily recommend you doing this in your neighborhood. If you're daring, you can. Most people would call that trespassing today. Yes. But back during that time period, they would go to their neighbors and their friends, and they would ring the doorbell, or they'd knock on the door, and they'd open the door, and they'd begin singing Christmas carols. So the idea of singing Christmas carols and caroling was stationary. When they began to move from home to home, they called that act wassailing. So if you ever remember the Christmas song, yep, Here We Come A-Wassailing, that's where that comes from, is wassailing was a form of bringing the carols from door to door, home to home, and singing Christmas carols.
Oh. So let's go back a second. You said all of Christmas was banned, or?
It was Christmas stopped, the celebration of Christmas stopped,
okay,
and Christmas carols stopped. Now, if you ask me the question of why, I don't have that information because I haven't researched that information. But I do know that it was 1647 and Oliver Cromwell, and that's why caroling started to branch off in secret and in smaller groups.
And so, at night, maybe.
And at night when they would sing in homes.
Okay, that's interesting. So it's like the underground
underground movement. If you join us next year, we'll have the answer to that question.
Okay. Well, we can look that up, or you can look that up. I mean, they do have Google.
They do.
Yeah,
they do. Yes.
So. Let's talk about Santa for a minute. Let's go back to Saint Nick. Mm-hmm. Why don't you give us some opinions on? I know it's one of those things where a lot of parents feel conflicted. Yeah. Where it's like, if we bring Santa into Christmas, then are we not celebrating Jesus? Is the focus not on the sacred? Is it not? Are we steering our children away from what the true meaning of Christmas is?
Right.
How do we handle that as parents?
Obviously, we see a modern day, commercialization of Christmas. We see Saint Nicholas and his act and where the origin happened. And there's other origins that people talk about, but Saint Nicholas is the most agreed upon where it began. So you take a man who loved the Lord and a man who was kind to the poor and kind to others, and that's a great example for us to be able to teach our children. So as far as Saint Nick goes, it is. Well, you see, a red coat and reindeer and everything else, and you see that modernization happen. So I like to say two things can be true at one time. As opposed to making Christmas an either or, it's okay to make sure that we do a both and from time to time. And so for parents, I would say first and foremost to pray about what your convictions are, because every family is different. And I would say for those that want to just focus on the celebration of Christmas to Christ, then that's your conviction, and that's okay. You can do that. However, if parents want to know, well, is it not biblical to celebrate, Santa Claus or this? I would say, again, there is nothing in Scripture that bans the celebration of Santa Claus or the stories. We tell stories to our kids all the time. However, both things can be true. Can we celebrate a fun holiday and give gifts and celebrate the mystery of Christmas with Santa Claus? Sure. However, we need to make sure that we are constantly, not just one day of year. And I think that's where families worry about it. Mm-hmm. If you're a family like our family, where 365 days a year, there is no mistake in our family and no mistake to our son of who Jesus is and why we celebrate Christmas. There's no question of that. We celebrate Christmas because of Christ coming into the world. So if you're a family like that, then you can participate in some of the modern day gift giving, modern day, traditions without fear of it getting lost in the real meaning of the season. I think where Christians or families get worried is when there is too much of a focus on Christmas and not enough focus on the truth. And to those families, I would say, well, you might need to augment the truth in your family more so. And our family, one of the traditions that we typically do, and I encourage as families to do this, is even all the way up, even into this year, we've done it for 17 years in a row, and we will do it an 18th year in a row, is we gather around Christmas, we gather gather around a manger that we set up every single year. And every single year we have candles. And over time, those candles have become Bethlehem candles from Bethlehem. And before we do anything, before we open stockings, before we open gifts, we stand in front of that manger, and as a family, and you sometimes at as early as 5 o'clock in the morning, lately with the teenager, more like about 7:30 and 8. We light those candles, and we, as a family, in the quiet of our home, we sing happy birthday to Jesus. And there's no pushback. It is our moment to be able to say, we recognize what the true meaning of the season is, and we give thanks to God for all that we have. And so if you're a family and you do that, I think you can celebrate both without any conviction whatsoever.
Yeah, we would always, growing up in my house, we would read Luke 2. That was what we would sit down and read that before we did anything else.
That's
so,
sweet.
Yeah.
It's very sweet.
So you've been doing all the studying, all the research. What Christmas tradition from history do you personally find the most interesting?
We like the idea of, as we hearken back to December 24th and the decorating of the tree, and the story of St. Nicholas and throwing the gift on December 24th in the night. We as a family, we give one gift to our son every Christmas Eve. And that has been fun because after Christmas Eve service, and after Christmas Eve dinner, we gather around the Christmas tree and we typically say, okay, there's one gift. Now, when he was younger, he could pick whatever gift he wanted. Now that gifts are a little bit more expensive and a little less, we usually choose the gift that he's allowed to open during that time. But that's a tradition that we have, just to kind of a little tease Christmas morning as a family. So that's one that we practice today.
So if you could revive a historical tradition that's like mostly disappeared, what would it be?
That's good. I think one of the ones that, just reading through that, the idea on the stockings of placing a tangerine or an orange in a stocking would be something of a tradition that you could do. And you might say, why would you do that?
We got that growing up.
Yes. It's because early on, when the tradition of placing gifts in the stockings began to arise. Remember, I told you that the first Christmas trees were decorated with the creation story. And the creation story was life. And many of the Christmas trees in that early time period would be decorated with fruit because it was God giving abundantly to his creation. And so when you take what St. Nicholas did and when you take the stockings, being able to place a tangerine or an orange was typical back in those early days. And it was to combine basically both ideas, that we're celebrating God's Son, but with the creation of this world, the gift that he's given humanity. And so the idea of that fruit is to hearken back to the creation story. And so it kind of merges and combines all of those wonderful. God is the giver of life. And that is that representation in the stocking. So if you want to surprise your kids, it's a great opportunity. Throw some fruit in there and be able to tell that story.
So we did tangerines every year. We got tangerines, and we still do that in our stockings. But I honestly thought it was because it fit right in the toe, and it just filled that little space. I never knew the origin.
Oh, that's great.
I love that.
That's wonderful.
And honestly, my mom grew up in Japan, so I didn't know if that was some kind of I don't know.
Interesting.
I love that.
Yeah.
Now I know why.
There you go.
So as we close today, what would you hope people take away from this deeper understanding of history of Christmas?
Well, we always say in our church, it's really important that everyone owns their faith. Everyone has biblical opinion, but not a lot of biblical knowledge. I think the same goes with our holidays. Like, why are we doing the things that we do? Why are we celebrating the things that we celebrate? And I'm guilty of it too. There's a lot of things that we just do every year, and I've never stopped and paused and gone, why do we do this? Like stockings. Why do we hang stockings? I think as families, to be able to have those answers, there's so much rich tradition that symbolizes Christ. And so for families that are struggling on, I don't know how to talk to my kids about Jesus. Well, you do, because all you have to do is, we have the world at our fingertips in technology. It doesn't take long to be able to educate ourselves on certain traditions and the meanings behind them. And so this Christmas, if you would just look at a few, either listen to this podcast or look for yourself into some of the traditions, and then when your family participates, if you just say, do you know why we do this, kids? they're going to be curious because they're doing it and they love asking questions. So it would be great for you to be able to tie that back into the real meaning of the season.
It's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for today. And thank you for joining us.
Appreciate it.
And thank you for joining us for this edition of our Ocean View podcast. If you would, you can go on our YouTube channel if you're not on our YouTube channel and like this and then subscribe, which will give you notifications of any additional podcasts or messages that come up on our channel. So again, thank you so much for joining us.